Comes to us from the Gospel according to Mark, the first chapter, verses 9 through 11. Listen for God's word as it comes to us today. Mark writes, "At this time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. The moment he came out of the water, he saw the sky split open and God's Spirit, looking like a dove, come down on him. Along with the Spirit, a voice, 'You are my Son, chosen and marked by my love, pride of my life.'" And here the reading ends, and may God bless these words as we seek to apply them to our lives. The divine agreement. This sermon is for anybody who has ever said, when I die, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to heaven, I'm going to grab God by the shirt collar, and I'm going to say, "Why did you allow this to happen to me, to my loved one, to my child?" This sermon is for anybody who's ever wanted to go to heaven and to talk with God and say, "How come you did not intervene when my child, my spouse, my friend, my neighbor? How come, God? How come?" This sermon is for anybody who has said, as Jesus said, "My God, why have you abandoned me?" If you said those things, then you know what? You are in good company. Because everybody who's been a faithful follower of Jesus, anybody who considers themselves a child of God, from the moment of Mark's community all the way forward to this present day, has said that. And when we take seriously Mark's gospel, he presents to us questions that I'm not going to answer, because Mark doesn't answer them. And you're going to leave here today puzzled and pondering and wondering what this really was all about, which is exactly what Mark wants you to do. Today we continue the sermon series on Jesus is greater than Christianity. And the whole purpose of this sermon series is to show you the context of the first century from which the material of the New Testament came out of. And the key is for you to see that the most important words in the New Testament are the words according to. The gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The gospel according to Paul. The gospel according to Peter and James and Hebrews and the book of Revelation and the book of John. That each one of these gospel writers are saying what Jesus meant to them, where the whole idea is for you to be able to say by the end of the series what Jesus means to you. Who is he according to you? Who is God according to you? And if you've been following this, you've watched how the scriptures have emerged out of the first century. And today we continue looking at the gospel according to Mark. Now, I want to say something here. We make a huge mistake when we study the Gospels, and that we cram all the Gospels together, and we think as though each one of the Gospels are telling the exact same story, just a little bit differently. And so we think we're looking just for the same message or the same story about the life of Jesus. That is one of the most fundamentally wrong assumptions about the New Testament. And what we have to do is to take them and separate them out apart. In fact, one of the things that I did, I'll never forget this when I was seminary, is I photocopied off each of the Gospels and set them aside and stapled them together so that I could see them, force myself to see them as separate. Now, when you do this with Mark, what you begin to see is that it is a very heavy message. In fact, when I teach this part of a class as far as a New Testament survey, everybody walks out of this class going, "Ugh." So I want you to get ready. I want you to strap a theological seatbelt on. I want you to do something hopeful and positive this afternoon. I want you to remember that it's a beautiful sunny day. Because, I sat down last night, when I kind of finished it, I went, "Boy, you sure you should do this?" And I said, "Yeah, I should do this." Because you need to know what Mark's gospel says. And the only way that we can have any integrity around it is to give it an honest look and allow it to speak honestly to us. So let's press on. The context. We have to remember the context. I've been talking about context. You have to know the context and understand the New Testament. Briefly, what we talked about last Sunday is that there is a military pogrom that is going on. The Roman Empire has sent a Roman legion of troops, somewhere between 47 and 67,000 troops, and they're moving from the north to the south of Palestine, and they are destroying everything in its path. They are coming into villages. They are burning homes, synagogues, tearing things down. The people they capture, they either execute, they crucify them, they behead them, or they send them to slaves up to the city of Rome itself. That the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Mark, is written with the boot of a Roman soldier on its neck. This is wartime literature. This is somebody, Mark's community, and the author of Mark's community is trying to help people make sense of their impending suffering and their impending death because they know it's coming. They can smell the smoke. The people from the village ahead of them have fled into their town. Mark's community is probably sheltering people. And they're wondering, how could God allow this to happen? And so Mark writes a story that is designed to be heard. The majority of the people are illiterate. Mark could be the only person in his community who can write. His Greek is rudimentary. It's basic. So we know that's probably the case. And he's trying to convey to them a very specific message. Now, there are three keys about understanding Mark's gospel that when you understand these three things, they kind of unlock. And it's the baptism, it's the crucifixion, and it's the resurrection. I'm going to deal with the baptism and the crucifixion today, and next Sunday I'm going to deal with the resurrection. Come back. So let's look at the baptism. Let's begin by looking at the baptism. The first thing I need to tell you is you think you know what's happening with the baptism of Jesus because you've heard the story 1,000 times. If you grew up in the church, you've heard us read the story of the baptism, and you think you know what's going on, and I need to tell you, forget it. Forget everything you've learned about the baptism. Just wipe it out of your brain because you don't get it. You don't know. And to understand Mark's gospel, I have to really show you what Mark is trying to say. So forget it and listen. What Mark is trying to say is, it was interesting because, Mark begins his gospel with the baptism. There's no Mary and Joseph and the angel Gabriel and shepherd and sheep. In fact, if we just had Mark's gospel, there would be no Christmas because Mark doesn't consider any of that important at all. It begins with the baptism, and we don't even really know how old Jesus is. And Mark doesn't say, Mark says it's not important. He could be 16, he could be 66. It's not important. But what he basically says is that Jesus, the story begins with that Jesus of Nazareth comes to the Jordan River to be baptized. The key thing is that it's Jesus of Nazareth. He's not Jesus the Messiah. He's not Jesus the Christ. He's Jesus the guy from Nazareth, which is a beat-up old town on a hillside that nobody cares about. It's like Idaho Springs. I mean, do you care about Idaho Springs? No. You drive through Idaho Springs. It's the home of the gold diggers, the thing on the... How many times have you stopped in Idaho Springs? For pizza. You pull in, you go to the place, you eat pizza, you leave. You don't care about Idaho Springs. Nothing personal up there if you're from Idaho Springs. If I had told you that the Messiah was from Idaho Springs, you would say, what? That's Nazareth. The point being, he's a guy. And he's coming to the Jordan River, which is about a week and a half walk, to be baptized by John in the Jordan River. Now, baptism is not a Christian thing. Baptism is a Jewish thing. It's a water purification rite that they had been doing for centuries. And John, by baptizing people, is inviting them to come to the Jordan River to be purified, because John believes that the nation of Palestine, the nation of Israel, needs to be purified. The temple needs to be purified. And he's kind of a zealot. He's an Essene who lives out in the middle of nowhere. And when we were in Israel a year and a half ago, we actually went to the Jordan River, where they think that this whole thing took place. And it's just a muddy spit hole. I mean, to tell you, it's nothing fancy. And to be going down in that river, oh, yuck. Anyways, so Jesus, by making the trip, walking down to John, he is saying, I agree, John. I agree. The nation needs to be purified. The temple needs to be purified. And I agree. And he shows up as a guy to be baptized. The difference is he goes down into the water and comes up out of the water. Everybody else is sputtering, and getting the water out of their nose and their eyes, but not Jesus. Something happens. And like the heavens and the Holy Spirit and these words, and it's like suddenly the guy Jesus is gone. And something happens in the baptism, and he is transformed. Because when he comes out of the water, God's voice is heard. Now listen to what God says. You are my son, chosen, marked by my love. The key word is chosen. Chosen. God at this point is choosing Jesus. God, in other words, has looked down upon the creation and has seen all the human beings, and he sees this guy as being the guy that I'm going to lift up and say, you all need to live as this guy lives. I am adopting this guy. I want you to live as this guy lives. I want you to pray as this guy prays. I want you to worship. I want you to die as this guy dies. There's the foreshadowing. I want you to die as this guy dies. And the key is chosen. He's a guy. Hold that thought. Then the story kind of romps along. The story kind of romps along. You know that Jesus calls his 12 disciples, and then he walks on water, and then he feeds 5,000, and then he heals and the lepers, and everybody's going, wow, this is so cool. Because here's the key thing to pay attention to, a great insight. This might be the very first time that they have heard the story of Jesus told in a linear fashion. Because the Q source, remember we've been talking about the Q source, is like the Gospel of Thomas. If you've ever read the Gospel of Thomas, it's just sayings from the teaching of Jesus. And Jesus said, and Jesus said, and Jesus said. There's nothing about a linear story. Since Mark is the earliest gospel, this might be the first time that anybody has heard a linear account of the life of Jesus. So they could be hanging on every single word of this guy that God adopted. And he healed all these people, and he fed, and then he's ratted out. One of his own people betray him. And he has a Last Supper. Back to the context. They're hearing this gospel. It's a piece of wartime literature. The Romans are in the next town. He's been betrayed. He has a Last Supper. He goes to a garden where he prays, please, God, is there any other way? He's arrested by Romans. Context, they're in the next town. He's tried in a kangaroo court. He is beaten by Romans. The Roman legions are coming down from the next town. After he is beaten, he is taken to a cross where he is crucified by Romans. They are seeing their friends and family being crucified by Romans. Here's the interesting thing. The Q source has no mention of the crucifixion. the official stories that have been gathered about the life of Jesus have no mention of the crucifixion. Suddenly, with Mark's gospel, the crucifixion story is told. And in relation to all the other gospels, Mark's story of the crucifixion is by far the longest and the bloodiest. It is if the entire gospel is a precursor to the crucifixion, to get you ready for the crucifixion. And you have to ask, or I ask myself the question, what is Mark trying to convey? Here God adopts his son, and he does this amazing life, and then he gets tried, and he gets persecuted, and he gets beat up, and then he gets crucified. And this adopted son screams, my God, why have you abandoned me?" And you can smell the dust of the Roman soldiers coming into Mark's town. What does it mean? What is Mark wanting to convey? You know, for me, and this is my take on it, is I really think Mark wants his hearers to identify with Jesus. He wants them to go to the adoption, the baptism, and see that Jesus was just a guy just like they are. And that God chooses Jesus just as God chooses them. And that Jesus lives a life, Jesus has a ministry, and they're a part of this ministry. But then, what Mark wants his readers to see is, just because he's the adopted son of God, doesn't mean he's exempt from suffering. Just because he's the son of God doesn't mean he's exempt from persecution. Just because he's the son of God doesn't mean he's exempt from death. Because in Mark's gospel, Jesus just dies. That's it. And it's a stunning, quieting portrayal of what is going to happen to them. Just because they follow Jesus doesn't mean they're exempt. You know, I call it the divine agreement. We think, and it's somewhere kind of tacitly in our brain, we think that there's this agreement between us and God that, okay, God, look, we're going to follow you, we're going to love you, we're going to pray to you, we're going to do our best to avoid sinning, we're going to go to church, hopefully every Sunday. We're going to be good. And the agreement is, if we're going to be good, you're going to be good to us. You're going to love us. You're going to forgive us. You're going to watch out for us. You're going to protect us. You're going to protect the people that we love and care about. You're going to protect our spouses and our children and our neighbors. You're going to protect us. That's the divine agreement that we think God and I have signed. That's why it's kind of a tacit agreement. No one really signed it, but we think it's kind of there. So that when bad things happen to us, we go, hey, I thought we had an agreement. And God says, huh? We had no such agreement. Not at all. You're not exempt from suffering. It's just kind of a part of life that I created, that I've called good. You're going to suffer. You know, it's a lesson that I've had to learn repeatedly in my own life. You know, that no one is exempt, not me. You know, that for those of you who are new to Columbine and you haven't heard my entire life story, because throughout my 30 years here at Columbine, good Lord, you think I'd get a life. Really. You know, what I've been trying to do is I try to be vulnerable with you and kind of share with you the things that happen to me, the things that I wrestle with, hopefully that you too will learn from them. And those of you who have been at Columbine a long time have heard the stories of way back, a lost pregnancy, a child who had a deathly illness, an adoption that went horribly south, and a long, ugly court battle of releasing the child back to the state of Colorado. The shootings at Columbine High School, a stolen identity, a false arrest, a night in jail, dealing with the loss of integrity of that. You know, and there have been times I've been said, hey, I'm a minister. Like I'm working on your behalf. And I always hear back, I said, so? What makes you so special? What makes you exempt? You know, I love it when I fly, you know, on airplanes, you know, and people sit next to me and they start chat. What do you do for a living? I'm a minister. And they always say, oh, thank goodness, surely this plane won't go down. Lady, you are on the wrong plane, baby. You're on the wrong plane. There ain't no one is exempt. You know, and for me, where I had to really come to terms with this was when I was in Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. And when you walk through the grounds of Auschwitz and you can hear the echoes of the thousands who suffered. And you walk through the barracks and you see the piles of shoes and the hair that they saved. And you go through the gas oven. This is the oven. And you stand there. And you see the claw marks on the walls. And I stood there and said, if God didn't intervene in this, then God's not going to intervene in my hangnails. I had to come to terms with, well, then where is God? How does God work? Is there a God? Have we made this whole thing up? Well, I keep on coming down to the fact there is a God. This book, Proof of Heaven. I got done reading it. Thank goodness. There is a God. There is a God. And I believe that God permeates the creation and that God is with us. Where was God in the middle of the gas chambers? God was there. It doesn't mean that we're exempt. It doesn't mean we won't suffer. It just means that God is there. It's like the 23rd Psalm. I think, you know, there are so many significant pieces of literature in the Bible, and the 23rd Psalm, I think, is one of the most significant. You know, the 23rd Psalm assumes that there is a valley of the shadow of death. It assumes it. And it assumes you're walking through it. No exemption. There is a valley of shadow of death, and you're walking through it. However, you're not walking alone. For the Lord is with me. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He restores my soul. He prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Surely goodness and mercy shall be with me all the days of my life. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. He does not say you get to walk around the valley. And I have to think that these good and faithful Jewish people who followed Jesus, who were part of Mark's community, somehow had that ringing in the back of their mind as the Romans banged on their door and busted down their door. And they knew what was imminent. And as they were arresting them and dragging them out, Mark says, wait, there's more to the story. He was dead. And they took him and they laid him in a tomb. And 3 days later, women came. I'm out of time. I guess I'll pick that up next Sunday.